This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, good morning everyone. Shalom Aleichem. We're continuing in the Shoneh Halachos of Rabbi Kanievsky. In the last year we did over Chol HaMoed, we focused on Sifkatan Chaf Gimel, which is during the meal, should you say Al Narais Bavel or Shir Hamalais? The Mishnah Berurah makes it dependent on whether you say Tachnun or not. That when you say Tachnun, you say Al Narais Bavel. When you don't say Tachnun, you say Shir Hamalais. And we discussed, well, what do you do on days that really you should say Tachnun, but there seems to be side reasons that you don't say Tachnun. For instance, these days after Nisan, where inherently perhaps you should say Tachnun, it's only because the Avar Kol V'Yatza Roi V'Chodesh B'Kedusha, or let's say days that there are a Siyam or a Sheva Brachos. So we're up to Ois Chaf Daled. We're up to Sivkatan Chaf Daled. Where's my Sefer Das Noite? I think that's it. Okay, Sivkatan Chaf Daled. HaMekubalim harichu ma'od. Thank you. The Mekubalim speak at great lengths. Begoidel malas kimas chatzos. The greatness of getting up at midnight. Ukvar nidfas b'sidurim. It's already published in the Sidurim. Seder hahanhaga, the order of how one should practice uzman chatzos, and when the time of chatzos is. It's hutamid b'chatzos alayla. It's always in middle of the night. Dahainu yud bei shois achar chatziyayam. 12 hours after midday. Hein beleilos haruchos v'hein beleilos hakzaris. So basically, you split the day, whenever the day is, whether it could be sometimes 12 a.m. or sometimes 1 a.m. or sometimes 12:30. 12 hours later, exactly is midnight. Basically, it's going to be the exact same time. If midday is 12:27. Midnight will be 12:27, and so forth. And the Mekubalim speak at length about the importance of getting up at midnight to mourn the Churban Beis HaMikdash. Now, question, do you have to do this? Do you know anyone who does this? So in the Sefer Das Noite, the first tshuva in the whole Sefer is Kimas Tikun Chatzos. Is it a chiyuv for Bnei Yeshiva? Let's say people that are learning. So the answer is Kimas Chatzos Ein Chiyuv. It's not obligatory. This is not obligatory. He brings in the footnotes from the Eshel Avram of Buchach that even though the Svarim tell us about the importance and the chumras of someone who doesn't get up at Chatzos, Chazal never intended for somebody who needs to sleep just to keep themselves going. They're talking about people who sleep extra just for pleasure, but in other words, it's talking about people, they're up. You're up anyway. And you're just chilling out. So then you should do it. But if you're not up at all, there's no chumrah at all that you have to stay up to say Tikun Chatzos. And Reb Chaim Kanievsky added, the whole inyan of Tikun Chatzos is not a chiyuv. B'chlal, it's not an obligation. Then he brings a yeshiva bachar that he's learning after Chatzos. Is he better not learning and saying Tikun? So Reb Chaim said, no. You're not obligated even if you're up anyway. There's no obligation. There's not an obligation. This is an extra pious practice. He brings in the footnote that the whole inyan of Amiras Tikun Chatzos is not a chiyuv, like Rabbi Yaakov Emden says in Siman Aleph. And somebody who doesn't usually do it, he doesn't have to stop his learning. If you want to, you're allowed to, because it's an inyan. What about during the 3 weeks? Should a yeshiva bachar say Tikun Chatzos? Chaim said if he wants to. Now, the Mishnah Berurah in Siman Aleph Sivkatan Yud Beis, he says someone who knows how to learn, he doesn't have to say so many supplications and tefillos that are printed in the Sidurim. It's better to learn instead. Do we learn from here that learning Torah is better than Tikun Chatzos? So Chaim said those who their custom is to say Tikun Chatzos should continue to do so. Then somebody asked Reb Chaim that his minhag was to say Tikun Chatzos, but then he saw Rabbi Yaakov Emden writes that Tikun Chatzos is not for everybody, so should he stop? So Reb Chaim said, don't stop. Then he asked him, are women chayiv in Tikun Chatzos? So Chaim, we never heard such a thing. Now what if you could either do Tikun Chatzos or daven netz? No way you're going to pull off both. I can stay up till 12:30 and get up at 4:30. So Chaim said, davening is more important. Davening early is more important than staying up late for Din Chatzos. What's more important, Tikun Chatzos or Slichos during Yom Naram? Reb Chaim said, whichever one you want. Slichos is not more important than Tikun Chatzos. Do you say Tikun Chatzos on days you don't say Tachnun? So then there are two Tikunim. There's Tikun Rachel and Tikun Leah. You just do Tikun Leah. Okay, let's continue on over here. The Mishnah Berurah says, Sivkat Nechavei, Nachain sheyomer hatikun koydem Chatzos ma'at. It's better to say Tikun Chatzos a little bit before Chatzos. From Chatzos and on, Yasek b'Torah, you should be involved in learning Torah. V'shir Mishnayis koydem l'chol davar. Learning Mishnayis takes precedence over anything. That means at that hour, at that early wee hours of the morning, Mishnayis is the most important limud. If you merit to be a Kabbalist, those hours are very predisposed and opportune. That time is very misugal. Now, they asked Reb Chaim, because the Mishnah Berurah and Reb Chaim just quoted here in the Shoneh Halachos, he says the appropriate Zman for Tikun Chatzos is a little bit before Chatzos, right? We just saw in Chafhei that the proper time to say Tikun Chatzos is Koydem Chatzos Ma'at. So the question is, all the Mekubalim say Tikun Chatzos is after Chatzos. We're in down 9:15. The proper time is after Chatzos. So that's against all the Mekubalim. So Reb Chaim said the Mishnah Berurah is quoting from the Mikdash Melech and the Artzos HaChaim, and they were also Mekubalim, and the Mishnah Berurah is going with this opinion that this is the more appropriate time, namely right before Chatzos. Interesting. So the opinion of Mishnah Berurah is a little bit before Chatzos. Okay. Sivkat and Chavav. Over Seif Halayla. So now you got up before midnight. You did the Tikun Chatzos. At Chatzos, you were learned Torah. Mishnayos takes precedence over everything. If you were Zoicha to Kabbalah, that time is Mesugal Ma'od. And at the end of the night, Sivkat and Chavav, at the end of the night, Yivakish Tzrachav, you should ask for your needs. V'yesh sha'imrim az shoimrim laboiker. Some say at that hour, shoim laboiker. V'im nesacher miloimer Tikun Chatzos at Karv l'netzach chama. Let's say you got delayed saying Tikun Chatzos until close to morning. Yoimer hamizmoirim levad. Just say the psalms that are printed as part of this program. V'yedaleg hakinus. Skip the kinus. V'achar kach yoimer shomer laboker. And then you say shomer laboker. Sivkatim chavzayin. Yesh achroinim shekasvu she'ein sarach lakum mishvuos ad Tisha B'Av. There are some achroinim who say from Shavuos when you say shichvi, lie down, in Rus, you say, Shichvi ad haboiker. And in Eicha on Tisha B'Av, you say, Kumi roini balayla. So in Rus, you say, go to sleep. In Eicha, you say, get up. So some say, from the time it says, go to sleep, until it says, get up, you don't have to say Tikun Chatzos. Okay, so from Shavuos and Tisha B'Av. V'yesh oimrim, some say no. So according to that, you're only off the hook from Shavuos to Tisha B'Av. But some say that you don't have to get up only from Tu B'Av until Tesvav B'Iyar, meaning you're off the hook from Tesvav B'Iyar until Tu B'Av. It's a little bit of an extended omission of Tikun Chatzos. V'hanoyegim al pi Kabbalah, those who follow the Kabbalistic practice, Soivrim, they hold shetzarach lakum tamid, that you have to get up always. Now, Sivkatan Chavchas. Chabura sheneschabra yachad loymar Tikun Chatzos b'tzibur. Let's say you have a chabura. You know, in some places they have a hard time getting a minyan for Shacharis. In other places they have a hard time getting a minyan for Tikun Chatzos. So a chabura that they gather together to say Tikun Chatzos b'tzibur ein lamoinam. We're not going to stop them. V'adarabah, just the opposite. B'roi vam hajas melech. It's an Indian of b'roi vam hajas melech. Now it's interesting. Why would you think you shouldn't say Tikun Chatzos with a minyan? So a friend of mine, Mayor Jacobson, said, by Sudas HaMafsekes, we say you shouldn't do it with a chabura, because that's something like your avelam, you do it in solitude. So you would think, Tikun Chatzos, you should not do it together in a chabura. So And Adarabba, B'roivam Hadros Melech, V'tov Yoser Sheyomru Es HaTikun B'Beis HaKnesses M'Sheyomru B'Cheder HaSamachloi. Better to say the Tikun in a shul than to say it in an adjoining room. Now, they asked Reb Chaim that it sounds like that a room next to the shul has some additional kedusha. It's just the shul itself is better. Otherwise, what's he saying is better to say it in the shul than a room adjoining the shul. So what does a room next to a shul, what's the kedusha of a room next to a shul? So we say, for some reason, you ever go, Friday, people love to daven in the women's section. What's going on over there that people are... But Reb Chaim said that some people learn there, and people who come late, they daven there. So the room next to the shul has some kedusha. Okay. Siv Katan. V'tzarch beyichud lihizar ma'oid misichas chulin ben urim balali. You have to be very careful from sichas chulin for those who stay up at night. Meaning, if you're going to stay up all night, you have to be very careful not to be idling, not to have idle chatter if you're getting up in the middle of the night for Tikun Chatzos. Siv Katan Chaf Tes. Mi she'enoi yachal lahashkim kodim ar haboiker machmashu chalash. Someone who can't get up early because they're weak. That's like, most of us today. Oy sheyadeh, or he knows, shem yakom ha'ashmaros, if he gets up early, yashein be'is ha'tfila, he's going to go to sleep. He's going to be falling asleep during davening. In other words, the guy says, if I'm going to get up, I'm going to conk out during davening. Mutav lishain kal hatzoyrach. It's better to sleep as much as you need. So in other words, as Reb Chaim Kanievsky pointed out, that Tikun Chatzos is not an obligation, and davening properly is an obligation, and if it's going to compromise your tefillah, you should sleep as much as you need to. Nevertheless, zahir ma'oid lakum shah, you should be very careful to get up an hour, ulafachos chatzi shah, or at least a half hour, koidem kriyas hashamish, before the shamish comes to call you to come to davening. So back in the day, the shamish would come, they would knock on the shutters. I don't know how much time before davening the shamish would come to tell you to go to daven. Let's say he would come a half hour. You should get up at least a half hour or an hour before the veker comes to get you up, so that you could prepare yourselves to pray b'tzibur and with cleanliness. Okay. Now we're talking about the practice of the Tikun. There's a lot of things to say, but if you just rattle through it, it might not be meaningful at all. So he's quoting the Mishnah Berurah over here in the Mechaber and Sivdalid and the Mishnah Berurah Sivkatan Yud Beis. Toiv ma'at tachanunim bekavana meharbois beloy kavana. Better fewer supplications with kavana than many without kavana. Now this is a rule in general. This is a rule, let's say, for slichos. It's a rule for anything you don't really have to say, meaning anything which is not outright obligatory. It doesn't apply really to Psukei de Zimra. There's certain things you have to say. You can't say, well, I'm just going to say less with more kavana. You can't say, I'm going to say 3 brachas of Shemona Esrei with more kavana instead of the whole thing without kavana. However, the Mishnah Berurah adds, even though it's better to say less with kavana than a lot without kavana, a lot with kavana is better than a little bit with kavana. I mean, don't say, I'm going to daven for 30 seconds with kavana, and it will be the same thing as someone who davens for an hour with kavana. No. Aval hamarbe, one who does a lot, kivan gamkein, aval ima hamarbe, kivan gamkein, if the one who does a lot also has kavana, hamarbe tov yoser, one who does more is better. V'im hamamayid, it's just that if somebody who does less, yesh lo yoines, has extenuating circumstances, ve'ino yachal aharech, and he can't do it for a long time. Or let's say he evaluates shem yarech, that if he does it long, lo yuchal lechavein, he won't be able to mechavein. So another 2 things. If somebody has an oines and he can't stay at slichos for 2 hours, or he could, just he can't be mechavein for 2 hours. Umemayit betachnunim, and he does less. Okay, we're going to have a battery timeout over here. So, but if the guy who does less, he has extenuating circumstances and he can't do more, or he evaluates that if he does more, he won't be able to mechavein, and he is memayit b'tachnunim, he does less. Va'oimrim b'kavana, and he does it b'kavana. Nechashev laHashem yizbarach, it will be considered by God, like the guy who has time, umarich betachnunim, and he elongates the supplication bekavana. Ve'alzeh shoninu, and regarding this we learned echad hamarbe ve'echad hamamit, whether you do a lot or whether you do a little, uvad sheichavin liba l'shamayim, as long as you have in mind to heaven. V'chein le'inyan talmud Torah ha'inyan came. The same thing is regarding learning. One guy learns a blot a week, and one guy learns 7 blot a week. But the guy who learns a blot a week, he's learning slower because he wants to understand it better. So then they're the same. Actually, if the one who learns more doesn't understand, then the one who learns less and understands is better. In other words, it's regarding Talmud Torah, it is worthwhile to give up on the quantity to have better quality of learning. Meaning when it comes to Talmud Torah, we apply the rule that toiv ma'at bekavana meharbais b'loy kavana. Better a little bit of learning and you understand it than a lot of learning and you don't understand it. Ki hakol toloi lifnei Hashem yizbarach. It is all dependent before God. Im oisa kol asher b'koychai lasos. If you do as much as you possibly could do. Okay, Sif Katan Lamed Aleph. So far we learned a number of reasons perhaps why one would not say Tikun Chatzos. Number 1, he doesn't have the endurance. He's going to fall asleep during davening. Number 2, let's say a person can't have kavanah, so he only wants to say a little bit to be able to be mechavin to a little bit that he says. But then we have another idea here in Sivkat and Lamed Aleph. Mi shehu bal Torah, someone who is capable of learning. V'yesh lo leiv lahavin v'lomad. He has a mind to understand and to learn. Yachal limnoya miloymar harbe tchinois ubakashos hanetfasos b'sidurim. He has the ability to refrain from saying many of the supplications and tefillos that are printed in the Sidurim. V'toiv yoiser sheyomayd b'makaymam. It's better to learn in their stead. So this was really a major reason, and Reb Chaim Kanievsky is going to use this regarding karbanos as well. Next week we'll learn about karbanos. Is one obligated to say karbanos? So Reb Chaim holds that you're not obligated to say karbanos, except for the Parshas HaTamid. And he relies on this Mishnah Berurah, even though this comment in the Mishnah Berurah is specifically talking about tefillos and bakashos and tchinos, is not talking about karbanos. But Reb Chaim applies it to karbanos. In other words, if someone is able to learn, one is allowed to learn instead of the recitation of karbanos. But the Parshas HaTamid we'll speak about next week is pretty obligatory. Sivkat Lamed Beis. This will be the last one. Tzarech ha'adam likbaya lo ye'es lilmoid sifrei musar b'chol yom. One is required to set aside time to learn works of musar every day. Ima'at ve'im harvei, whether a little or a lot. Ki hagado mechaveroi, one who's greater than their friend, yitzray gado mimenu, his yitzhara is greater than his friend's yitzhara. The greater you are, the greater the yitzhara. V'tavlin ha-yitzhara, and the medicine for the yitzhara, hu toichachas ma'amorei chazal, are the rebuke of the statements of chazal. V'hu yoiser chiyuv milim and mishnayos. It's a bigger obligation than learning mishnayos. So it's interesting. Well, where does mishnayos come in? So I would say because he just said earlier that if you're getting up in the middle of the night, the most important thing to learn is mishnayos. But even more important than mishnayos is to learn Sifrei Musar every day. Reb Gershon Edelstein said at Reb Chaim's Levaya, what do we do now? We don't have Reb Chaim Kanievsky. He said the most important Kabbalah is that people should accept upon themselves to learn Sifrei Musar b'chol yom. So even though Tikun Chatzos is not an obligation, and maybe even karbanos is not an obligation, but this seems to be very important, especially in our times, where the Yetzer Hara is very strong, and the only way really to subdue it is by learning Sifrei Musar. Okay, we'll hold it here. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Reb Gordon, for sponsoring the breakfast. And have a wonderful day, everyone. Kol tov.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.